One of the hallmarks of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive is that we give you the angles from all different perspectives. We don't just give you what our view is. It's not an echo chamber. We don't demonize anybody. We seek to get to the truth. And as you hear me say all the time, we want to know what is going on, ground truth reality. And in order to do that, you have to show all different perspectives. In the past, we've had an American general on this show who has talked about the views from his perspective, which is decidedly pro-Ukrainian. We've also had some shows on, that's General Hodges that we had there in the past. We've also had on an American who volunteered to fight for the Ukraine side, Matt Van Dyke, and we've had some other folks on here who were definitely on the pro-Ukraine side. And we've actually taken some heat because I didn't get into an argument with them or I didn't push back on some information. But the point when I bring on guests is not to get into an argument, but to show different perspectives. And today, for the first time, we're probably a little late getting to this, but we finally have someone from the Russian side who has been fighting for behalf of the Russian military. His name is Aidan Minnis. He is a British, Irish person of descent fighting on the side of the Russian forces. Aidan, first of all, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Daniel.
Well, listen, we'll just get right into it because a lot of people are going to be surprised by that, especially when they hear somebody from the UK is actually fighting on the Russian side, because there's a whole lot of reports that many in the UK fight on the Ukraine side as well. So I wonder, first of all, if you can just give us a little bit of a background as to how it is that you came to go from the UK into Russia.
Well, obviously, of course, this started in 2014, which everyone is aware of. And I've always been mistrusting of the government of the country that I've lived in. So I've always sought my own news or to, try and find out my own information. And it to me, at least, it became apparent quite quickly that something was amiss there. And when you see the likes of McCain and Newlands flying into Ukraine, preaching about democracy, I knew something was quite wrong. So, of course, that led me down a rabbit hole of information and looking to see what was going on. And quite quickly, you start seeing these videos of ethnic Russian people of the Donbass being murdered, and in Odessa and in Kharkiv. And of course, that's what started the idea in my head. And then, of course, it kind of snowballed from there. And I felt as though I had to really go and do something about it.
And so, I mean, what was like step one? You were somewhere in the UK and then you said, you know what, I'm going to go and do something about this. So what was your first step? How did you get to Russia?
Of course, when you're on social media, I suppose, especially Telegram, and you're following the events of the war. I mean, originally it would have been the Donbass militias against Ukraine, originally from 2014 to 2022, before Russia decided to intervene. So, of course, I was following it from that standpoint, and it was just getting worse and worse and worse. So I decided I would try and reach out to some people on these Telegram channels. Of course, when you're speaking on these channels and you're interacting with people, you're kind of networking at the same time. So you'll come across real people fighting in the war and stuff like that. So it was making connections. And when I made the connections, I decided that actually it is something that I wanted to do after about a year of thinking about it. Because it's not something that you sign up to, with short-sightedness. You kind of have to really decide it's either you're all in or you're not going to do it at all. So it was literally making connections. And then when I did, they helped me attain my visa. I booked my flight and I went over there. And literally within a couple of weeks, I was on the training ground of the Russian armed forces.
And I mean, were they, I guess the Russians that you initially made contact with, were they suspicious of you at first? I mean, how hard was it to gain their trust so that they knew that you weren't like some spy coming in, for example?
Right. Gotcha. There is an element of that, of course, especially, I suppose, especially if you're sort of from the English speaking Western world, i.e. if you're from the British Isles or you're from America or Canada or Australia, New Zealand, that kind of region of the Western world, some will be suspicious of you. But these networks exist now, and of course, just by you providing your details, you'll have security checks done on you, so they can work out quite quickly whether you're a regular person or whether you're someone to be suspicious of. And of course, if they're suspicious of you, they just won't bother dealing with you. But I mean, you can, when you speak to these people, you can figure out quite quickly, or they can at least, that if someone's genuine or not. And I think if you put your money where your mouth is and decide that you're actually going to go over and do it, then these people were really good and really helpful to me. And they're actually it was a German family that helped me actually, so I better say hello to them. But of course, they're within the Russian services also.
And how about the language? Did you already speak Russian? Do you speak Russian now? Did you learn it later? How did that work out?
That was probably the biggest hurdle, because of course some battalions they won't accept you because of the language barrier, because it can cause issues, especially if you're in the heat of battle and stuff. So I know basic Russian commands, I know basic Russian language, is not fluent by any means, but of course quite quickly, especially once you get onto the polygon, the training ground, and you start running through your drills and your tactics and your weapons training and stuff like that, you learn quite quickly to communicate with these people with little words said. I mean, that was one thing that we did do, especially in the assault battalion that I transferred to. Quite a bit of that training was done without making any noise whatsoever. So, you had to learn hand signals and stuff, but quite quickly you live with these people 24/7. So it kind of works itself out, if you know what I mean.
I see. And let's look back at the other half of this equation before you left, because since there are, especially the Western media, and I know that in some regards the British media is even more pro-Ukraine than the American media, which is saying something. But what about your family and friends back in the UK? How do they feel about you taking this action?
I mean, luckily for me, the first month or so, I'd say the first 2 months, I was able to keep it under wraps. So not a lot of people knew about it, not even my family. I kind of prepared in silence and then made my moves in silence, and then I was literally gone one day. It wasn't until after a few months I kind of let the cat out of the bag. But quite quickly after that, the press got hold of it. And as a result, you saw a campaign which was just full of vitriol. They went after my family, they went after me. And because of Britain being very pro-Ukrainian, and the news and the media, the radio, the TV, newspapers, constantly 24/7, it's Ukraine are good, Russia is bad, with their fantastical headlines that they come out with. So quite quickly, my family turned on me. The majority of my family, not all, the majority of my friends turned on me. So quite quickly, I was kind of alone with it. And but it didn't stop them harassing my family. Camping outside of their doors, knocking on their doors all hours of the day, throughout the night. We're talking like weeks on end when it originally broke. And then the media campaign, it was, I was on the front page of the papers and on the primetime news and on the radio. So yeah, it was quite brutal. Then of course, trolling and death threats on my social media. My family received death threats. Family members being assaulted in the streets and at school because of what I did. So it was quite brutal. I will admit. I'm not going to lie there. It was quite hard.
Oh gosh, it's really sorry to hear that, especially for all the family members. Well, my sympathies to that. But that also shows that you have a pretty significant depth of conviction for that. And I want to get into that in just a second. But let's start off with your training. We saw about a month or so ago, the leader of the Ukrainian armed forces was talking about how their troops get training before they go to the front. Watch this.
Speaking of the training, of course, everyone wants the level of training to be the best. So we train highly qualified professional military personnel. At the same time, the dynamics at the front require us to put conscripted servicemen into service as soon as possible. That is why we conduct a compulsory basic military training for at least a month, and qualified training, which is at least 2 weeks a month.
Now, what we have discovered, despite what he said there, is that there are very often maybe 4 or 5 days, and then they get thrown to the front. And these are some people who've never even held a weapon in their hand. They get to the front, and sometimes, and we've seen reports of this here recently, where like within 5 days of being grabbed off the streets, they're dead in frontline combat, which means they didn't have any training at all. What is it like for your training? How did you go from private citizen Aiden Menace to in a uniform, and how long did it take to get to the front line?
Well, I signed my contract on December 19th, I think it was, last year. So, like I said to you, we had probably maybe 4 weeks basic training in terms of, originally I was a sapper engineer, and then we deployed to the Donbass, and we probably had a similar amount again. So it was a couple of months altogether, but it was specialized training, and most of my time within the sapper battalion, the engineer regiment, sorry, most of my time was spent behind the lines, like 90% of it. So of course we were relatively safe, but we had enough training. I mean, you do your basic fitness training, of course. You do the polygon, tactical training, shooting, but of course it would probably be it was a lot less than what I did when I transferred to the motorized rifle regiment. Of course then it's a lot more intense, but I think it's a case of, depending on what regiment you're in, depending on what line you're going to be on, whether you're on the front line, the second line, or the rear, so I think it's all dependent on that. But the training I got was good. I can't complain.
It's from the time you got to the motorized rifle regiment, how much additional training before you saw your first combat?
Well, originally as a sapper, I was probably in Ukraine maybe 4 months the first time. So it's kind of like an ongoing thing. If something needs to be remedied, so if you're in one place and you're kind of behind the lines and you're not at any threat of being in combat, you kind of stay in that position. But then the closer to the line you'll get, for instance, if your regiment, or sorry, I suppose it would be a company, if your company as a part of a regiment is going to be moved closer to the front line, then of course you'll get additional training. So it was a case of ongoing training, but of course most of the work, as I said, was engineer work. So the 90% of it wasn't on the battlefield per se. It was kind of in the rear. It wasn't until I got to the motorized rifle regiment where it was from day one. It was intense training for 3 months, and then of course we deployed, and then we're consistently training and doing what we need to do before we go into battle.
And
if that answers your question,
as far as you know, anyway, is your experience representative of what any regular Russian person who had signed up would do?
Yeah, I think it's. I do know that when originally, before the Russians intervened, the Russian army intervened, and it was the Donbass militia. I think the training was probably a lot less, but that was because of you had a militia going up against an army backed by NATO, so it was kind of like David versus Goliath. So I think things were a bit different there. But now Russia have got the manpower, and they've got the time to be able to do this. So as far as I'm aware, 90% of the people that I've spoke to, probably a higher percentage, over 90% of the people that I've spoke to, they're kitted out correctly, they're trained correctly, and they'll be deployed correctly. But of course, being in a motorized rifle regiment, which most motorized rifle regiments, assault battalions, you know that you're going to go into the fire, so to speak. So yeah, I would say they have good training, especially if you were to compare it to the Ukrainians training. I think it's night and day, really.
Yeah, that's certainly from the reports we get. That is the case. I'm also curious about I guess, the extent to which the troops, your fellow troopers there, feel like there's enough fighters. Does Russia have enough? Do they have too few? Is it just about the right number? How do you guys feel when you're actually going into action?
Yeah, I would say, and again, you probably have close to 1 million soldiers on the if you were to combine all the lines, you'd probably have close to 1 million soldiers in the Russian army actually in the special military operations zone currently. So of course, you know, soldiers is the amount of soldiers is not a problem. So, and the amount of munitions and weaponry that we get is not a problem. In fact, I don't think that I've ever personally seen an issue when it comes to the amount of soldiers that we have, the amount of weapons that we have, the amount of munitions that we have. And I don't think I've spoken to anyone within the Russian army that have had those problems either.
I see. Let's look now at the combat here, because there is lots of well, actually, no, let me start with you personally first. Can you tell us what it was like the first time you came under enemy fire? How did you deal with that, coming from no background in the military to now under fire?
Well, I'd probably have to go back to when I entered Ukraine as a sapper in the engineer regiment. I think it was the second night that I arrived in Ukraine on a base. We came under fire to such an extent, it was quite brutal, to such an extent where we had to temporarily evacuate the base until more soldiers came to sort of steady the ship, so to speak. So yeah, the first time I experienced it, I mean, you're seeing the skylight up because it was at nighttime when it started. You know, the artillery and the rockets are getting closer, and you know, you're feeling them reverberate through your chest. Obviously, not close enough where it's going to damage you, but you know it's getting closer. And of course, you're hearing all the fire. The bullets flying everywhere. So the first time I experienced that, it was quite shocking. I mean, I had to sort of have a quick talk to myself quite quickly because, of course, I'm not a career soldier. I went from a simple civilian, and from being sat in my living room in Great Britain to getting on a plane to Russia, and then in the Donbass was literally a matter of months. So to go from the comfortable environment of your sofa in your couch, as Americans would say, in your living room, to then being on the battlefield in Russia, yeah, it was quite a shock to the system. But quite quickly, luckily, I was able to sort of steady my mind, and then quite quickly you kind of follow what the rest of the soldiers are doing, and your commanders, they were really good, and they were telling you what to do and guiding you. So quite quickly you kind of step into the zone, so to speak. But yeah, I won't lie, it was definitely frightening, and for a split second I did wonder what I got myself into, but I composed myself pretty quickly. But that was the first time that I kind of experienced it, the first time, and that was in Kremenaya.
And so, I mean, I can relate to that. I remember my first major combat engagement as well. And it sounds like it's probably universal among any soldier of any country, probably experiences similar things. Is it a case, because unlike me, I was in a really big battle, a tank battle in Desert Storm, but there was basically only 2 or 3 battles, and then the whole thing was over. It was only a 100-hour war on the ground anyway. Yours is not quite like that. This one has been going on for many years, as we've talked about. But can you tell us a little bit about what it's like, and for yourself personally, and for your comrades, as much as you guys talk about it, I suppose, is that one would think, okay, you're going in there and you're afraid that you could die. Obviously, that was part of what you experienced initially. But does that dissipate over time? And do you then just say, well, I don't worry about that anymore? Or is it always present?
I can only speak for myself, I think, in terms of that. So if we fast forward to me, my current deployment, and then being a member of the motorized rifle regiment, yeah, when your regiment goes into battle, it's kind of like, I mean, you'll probably know a few hours before that actually happens. But the thing is that there's sort of like little signs within the days leading up to it. So you kind of know something's going to happen. And, especially with the soldiers talking amongst themselves, of course, it can be like Chinese whispers. So you have to be careful of believing what people say, but you kind of know when something's going to happen. But then when you go into assault itself, there's a moment where I think everyone is kind of quiet and in their own thoughts, but it's soothing in terms of knowing that you're surrounded by soldiers that are your brothers, your comrades in arms that are going through the same thing, and that you spent all this time training with them, you spent this time living with them, eating with them, and sort of getting to know each other. You build the bond, as you would know, and quite quickly you kind of you kind of steady yourself. But I think it's the anticipation is probably worse than the battle itself, because once you go into battle, whilst you're initially scared and whilst you've got that trepidation and all those thoughts that kind of swim around, once the battle kicks in and bullets are flying everywhere, you've got no choice but to you're kind of living in the moment. So those thoughts kind of dissipate somewhat, and you're kind of in that zone, so to speak. So, and then it's not until it's over that you kind of, that's when I start shaking, and you feel the adrenaline running through you. So is I think before and after is probably the times which where you feel that fear most. But once you're actually in the battle itself, they kind of, you're in the zone. That's the only way I can really describe it, but you probably know what I'm on about.
That part I do, yeah. Now, for those of our viewers who are watching here, they may recall that it was actually about a month ago that we were initially going to have you on, but something happened right before it was supposed to have happened. You were supposed to have come on, and we found out later that because you had been wounded in action. I wonder if you can tell us, first of all, what happened with that, because you said it was a drone issue, and what was that like?
Well, there's different kinds of drones. Obviously, you've got the FPV drones, which are the kamikaze drones, I think, and then you got the smaller drones, which do the recon. But sometimes those smaller drones will be attached with grenades, and they can catch you by surprise, because sometimes you don't always hear those coming. Sometimes you're a bit busy doing a job or whatever, and then sometimes it could be too late. But I was in my blindash, which is like a combination of underground living quarters, but then you'll have a defensive position next to it. So I was kind of in there getting ready to come and catch the internet to do the interview with you, and then in the next thing I know, there's an explosion. I'm on the floor in pain. But luckily for me, the actual blindash took most of the brunt of it, and I was only injured with shrapnel. I would say in a minor way compared to some of the damage that you see drones do. So I would count my lucky stars that I only got a bit of damage. But yeah, I had 4 pieces of shrapnel embedded into my tibia, and my tibia's fractured. So yeah, I mean it's taken a while to put weight on it. I'm still in a plaster cast, so but it won't be long, and I'll be back to action, hopefully.
We had Matt Van Dyke, who had fought on the Ukraine side of the line, and he talked about a situation to where the drones were so pervasive. He said you literally was taking your life into your hands even to get out of a trench to go use the restroom. He said you just almost could never go out. There was always something, whether it's artillery, drones, rockets coming in from someplace. Is there any similar experience on the Russian side of the line?
Yeah, of course. Like it's so depending on where you are, of course, it's going to change from place to place. But where we were, drones were very prevalent, and so were mortars in artillery. And then, of course, sometimes you may be in a position. Your trenches may be in a position whereas you may have to walk a kilometer or so to get water. Sometimes it's difficult to you can't always place your defensive positions where you always want them, so sometimes it may mean you have to go out and get water. But yeah, we were always mindful. There was I could probably say maybe 10 times where we would go and collect water, and we would see a drone overhead and we had to run for cover. So yeah, it's you learn to fear them. It's no joke. Drones are no joke, because they can really catch you unawares, especially if you're
walking. Warfare has made it very difficult to leave a trench dugout on either side of the war. The Russians have largely caught up to us and maybe surpassed us in some ways with drone warfare. So you hear the noise, it sounds like a mosquito in your ear, and that's a drone coming. So at least you can hear them most of the time, and they're being used to drop grenades. It certainly has changed war. I mean, there's no real way to advance when you can't step out of the dugout even to take a leak without risk of dying from a grenade coming from the sky.
Now, that was Matt Van Dyke there. Now, the Ukraine side, and certainly all this year, they have persistently been on the defensive. They haven't done anything in the offensive other than a handful of local counterattacks in the defensive area itself. So they don't get out at all. But we also have had some reports recently that at least as of now, the Russian electronic warfare is making about 1 out of 10 of those drones from the Ukraine side successful. So 9 out of 10 are apparently being knocked down. How do you guys from your side defend against the Ukrainian drones that are coming back towards you?
Mechanized, motorized rifle regiments will tend to, they're an assault battalion or territorial defense, which can kind of end up in the same thing anyways. There's kind of like a dual job, so to speak. But they will usually have a certain unit within that regiment that will deal with that threat. So you will have people with that electronic capability and those electronics and drones and stuff. So yeah, we usually, from my experience anyway, within my motorized rifle regiment, that we've got a drone team there that sort of counter Ukrainian drones when they decide to fly over.
So is it something that you're, quote, terrified about? Is it just something you're concerned about? Is it just part of the background? That's just part of life on the front? How would you characterize the impact that drones have just generally on the frontline troops?
Yeah, they're no joke. I probably wouldn't use the word terrified, but at the same time, I wouldn't downplay it either, because if you find yourself in an open field and you're surrounded by them, or one's near you where you feel as though you might be at a disadvantage, you need to keep your eyes open. You need to have eyes in your back of your head. But thankfully for us, along the lines, so along the trenches, every so many feet, you'll have like a defensive position where you've got people on duty constantly. So they keep a watch out, security and stuff. So a lot of the time we'll know one's in the area, but then of course sometimes they can sneak in. They're very difficult to keep a handle on, because you've got the big drones which are easy to spot. You can hear them a mile off. But then you've got the little drones which they use Mavericks. They tend to be a lot harder. Sometimes you won't know they're there until they're on top of you. So yeah, you have to keep your eyes in your back of your head. If you're sat there and you kind of dismiss the threat of a drone, yeah, you're being quite silly and stupid. So the commanders and the officers are always on our case to keep an eye out for them. That's an important part of our job, so to speak.
I got it. And let's look at a related section here, and that is casualties. There has been a lot of reports in the Western media, really throughout the war, but the last month or so, for some reason, there seems to be even bigger ones, that claiming that Russia is suffering massive casualties. Some say up as much as 600,000 total. I've seen others, I think Media Zona and Medusa and some other outlets say it's less than that, but it could be as high as 80 to 100,000, which seems reasonable given the conditions out there, which is less than 600, but it's a huge, huge number. It's like double what the U.S. suffered in the Vietnam War. So first of all, how accurate are those reports? Well, actually, we'll just start with that. Do you see that?
All right. So I would, so from my experience being in the war and being on the front line, I would say there's probably, so if we were to talk about equipment for a second, I will answer your question on the casualties, but this is important, because I would say in terms of drones, probably especially where our regiment were stationed, we probably outnumbered them 10, 15 to 1 in terms of how many drones we got compared to them. The artillery exchanges was probably even higher, 20, 25 to 1. So for every 20, 25 shells that Russia are firing at Ukraine, we'd get one back. Of course, in terms of tanks, BMPs and armored vehicles, and even just basic Kamaz trucks and armored transporters, there is such a overwhelming advantage in terms of Russia compared to the Ukrainians. So of course that plays its part in being able to work out these casualties. I think from the beginning of the special military operation, I would say maybe 80 to 100,000 would probably be correct, but which is a high number, and I probably shouldn't be too direct in answering that question, but I would say it's probably around about then. But in terms of Ukrainian casualties, I'd probably times that by a lot higher, and you can simply work that out just by the amount of injuries that you see, which is usually 3-4 to 1 ratio. With if you get 3 or 4 injuries, it usually means you'll have a death in there. So if you from my experience, if you work that out, and the amount of equipment that you've got compared to them, with artillery exchanges, rocket exchanges, mortar exchanges, even gunfire exchanges, you can work out quite quickly that the Western media are massively overstating the casualties or the destruction of Russian equipment, and they seem to get their figures from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And I've looked at their figures, and they claim to have destroyed 10,000 tanks, and it's kind of like, you haven't, but
right.
Well,
so how does that affect morale on the front line on the Russian side? Because whatever the number actually is, I mean, no one will really know until the war is over, probably years afterwards, when they can actually account for all this stuff. But on the front line, and it doesn't even matter what the numbers are, they are there. I know you've mentioned that there's your battalion that you're in has suffered some significant casualties itself. How does that affect the guys who go out on the next mission?
Yeah, I think it definitely plays its part. I mean, I suppose it depends on the constitution of the individual. One thing I would say about Russians is that they are a completely different breed. I mean, the people that I've met, it's not, and I don't mean that as in they're like gung ho and they want to go out and kill somebody. That's not what I'm talking about. But these people are fearless, and if they're given an order, this needs to be done by hook or by crook, it'll get done. And I admire that massively. So whilst it does impact, especially when especially if you know these people, I mean, you without going into specific numbers, but you know how big a regiment is. So of course, whenever a certain company within that regiment goes on an assault, they're going to suffer casualties, and the likelihood is you're going to know these people really well because you live at the same base and you train at the same polygon and you're deployed in the same direction. So yeah. If you know these people, especially, it can be really tough. If you don't know these people personally, I think they're a part of your regiment, so they're still brothers in arms, but I think it's easier to sort of distance yourself from it, so to speak. But yeah, no, I'm not going to lie, it's tough. I mean, I know of a few people personally that were really good to me, really good friends that are no longer here. They died in battle. So I found that pretty tough. But of course, 99% of the Russian soldiers are there for the right reasons. It's not it's not them you're seeing snatched off the street, 10, 20 videos daily of people getting snatched off the street. That's not happening. These people are signing voluntary contracts. So, they're there for the right reasons. Of course, you may get the odd person that's not, but from my experience, 99% of the Russian army are there for the right reasons, and they'll use it as motivation to continue the fight. We will not stop.
Well, and that's actually where I wanted to go next, because that's directly tied to a side's willingness to endure casualties and keep going, and that is the motivation for why they fight. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the West portrays from the Russian side, and then I'm going to show you something that Putin said, and then I want to get your view on the backside of that. Many in the West characterize that the Russians used to be poorly motivated, but they said, look, this is a war of choice for Putin. He decided to go fight this, so the Russians are just doing it because they have to, because they're made to do it, or because they're so poor they have to go to take these jobs because they're offering so much money, but their hearts are really not into it, etc. But here, about a month or so ago, Putin made this comment where he said, hey, this is basically the West against us. This is an existential fight. Watch this.
Это решение будет принято. Это будет означать не что иное, как прямое участие стран НАТО, Соединенных Штатов, европейских стран в войне на Украине. Это их прямое участие. И это уже, конечно, существенным образом меняет саму суть, саму природу конфликта. Это будет означать, что страны НАТО, США, европейские страны воюют с Россией. А если это так, то, имея в виду изменение самой сути этого конфликта, мы будем принимать соответствующие решения, исходя из тех угроз, которые нам будут создавать.
So he was specifically talking there about the possibility of long-range weapons being allowed by the West to be used deep into Russia. But he's talking about a theme there, which has been echoed by many of the Russian leaders, that this is not just Russia choosing to fight Ukraine, but this is the West cumulatively using Ukraine to fight against Russia. How do the people that actually are fighting for this, how do they view it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it probably splits into two groups. You've got some that are not really too combative about it, whereas they're just fighting for Russia and they'll do what needs to be done. But then you will have a certain section of soldiers that are quite angry by it, and of course, like, how can you not be? Because it's Western weapons, it's Western money, it's Western mercenaries that are inflicting damage upon the Russian armed forces when they battle each other. And of course, when you talk about, or if I give an example of the Kursk invasion, which you had the fascist battalions and a high percentage of American and Polish mercenaries sort of going into that territory and then started mass murdering and raping people. It's that gets people angry because it's with the participation of Western mercenaries with Western money and Western guns. So yeah, there is anger within the Russian forces, but of course, what it does is give them further motivation to fight. I mean, whilst there will always be opposition to wars, Russia is unified, and when I say unified, I mean we're talking in the 90% region, unified in this. Russia must win this war. It's an existential threat. It was never just about Ukraine versus Russia. It was the ethnic Russian people of the Donbass, which were originally part of the Soviet Union. Nobody asked them when they decided to. When the West decided to play God and break the Soviet Union up. It's so. Yeah, I digress, but my point being, yeah, it is more than just Russia versus Ukraine. It is the West clearly want to contain Russia, and I believe that it's because they see the rise of Russia and China, and that will give birth to a multipolar world instead of a unipolar world where America run roughshod all over the globe. So, yeah, it does cause anger, and I have noticed an increase in that anger amongst soldiers because, when you're going into battle and your comrades are getting killed with Western weapons and by Western mercenaries, and they're seeing German tanks with iron crosses on. I mean, that bothers people, because of recent history.
Yeah, I actually had not ever thought about that consideration about what the frontline troops feel like when they see Western weapons being used against them. I can see where that would motivate them to do so. So you're at the moment convalescing. I think you said somewhere around 250 kilometers away from Moscow. What do people in Russia think about this war? Do they think they would think it's something that should be over? Do they agree with Putin? I mean, how do they? Because some of their family members are suffering these casualties.
The overwhelming experience that I've had with Russian people is they're very pro. They're very pro special military operation, and I say special military operation and not war because they realize the sacrifice that is being made here. They realize within their history the sacrifices they've made when they've got into major European wars. So they're not silly people. But of course, there's a saying that people use. I think it's something along the lines of they're slow to harness their horse, but it's kind of like once they do it, it's they're quick to ride. So they realize there's an existential threat. Russian people are very educated. The educational system here compared to the West, I would say, is far superior. I mean, you can have basic I can have conversations with just a normal everyday person in the street, and they start speaking about theology and history and all sorts of art, drama, stuff like that, which is that they seem very cultured. So they're not your average robot that people of the West seem to believe. So yeah, they realize what it is, but the overwhelming support is there for to win this war. And it is not in a bloodthirsty way either. They realize it's the existential threat, and it's a war that needs to be won simply because of the West's involvement as well. That sort of makes it very clear. So people are very clear-minded in terms of what this really is,
So one of the objectives of many in the West seems to be that, well, they want to drag this war out as long as possible so that support for Putin within the country will erode. Do you see, at least as much as you're able to, that the people would continue, like if this dragged on, let's say another year, 2 years, some infinite number into the unknown number into the future, would they keep being supportive, or would that support turn?
I think the cast is already died. I think the die is already cast. Sorry. The Russian people know what this is, as I said. They know it must be won, and I don't think there's another country on earth that can take the amount of. I'll try and word this in the right way. I don't think there's a country on earth that can sustain the trauma that is currently happening in this war like Russia can. We've seen when they've gone in the Napoleonic Wars, in the Second World War. There wars in the hundreds of years ago with the Poles and the Swedes and the Prussians. So yeah, they know what it is. I don't think there's any danger of that happening. In fact, the longer this goes on, and the more these stories come out, and the more these crimes reach the public, the more angry they are getting. So in fact, I would say the longer it goes on, the more steely determined the Russians are going to be in terms to win this war.
I see. A couple of other things I want to ask you about. One of the things that's also in the Western media a lot is that Russia has these inexplicable Meatwave tactics. When they assault a position, they'll just throw wave after wave of people. Who cares if they get killed? They'll just keep throwing them out there. Do you see evidence of that?
No, I don't. Of course, like it's easy saying that because we're talking combined arms warfare, probably not seen since World War II. So of course, whenever there's an assault from a regiment or battalion on enemy positions, there's going to be high casualties, and that goes for either side. But Meatwaves that's ridiculous. I mean, I'm still yet to see videos of these claims, and this has been going on since 2022. I mean, I think the last newspaper article I read, British newspaper article I read, was that Russians were attacking Ukrainian trenches with nothing but shovels. I mean, we know that's a lie. I mean, Russia probably have hundreds of years worth of rifles in factories. It's not. Weapons are not an issue. So when you hear those things like Meatwave attacks and all they've got is shovels, it's quite ridiculous. I mean, it really is silly. But that's not to say that whenever you get storm battalions, which both sides have them, whenever they engage in an assault, there is going to be casualties on both sides, and the casualties are probably going to be high in comparison to, say, an Iraq or an Afghanistan war, because it's more conventional. Both sides have the capabilities to wage war by sea, land, and air in a more even way. It's not to distract from those wars at all, but yeah, you're going to get high casualties, but no, not Meatwave attacks. That's completely the wrong word. It's not World War I where people blow a whistle and you fly over the trenches, but just naturally by that kind of warfare, you're going to get high casualties on both sides anyway.
And so it sounds like from what you're describing that it's actually an effective coordinated assault, where if you have an assault battalion, you have a support element, you have indirect fires coming in, perhaps drones mixed in with that, and then that's just the so-called assault wave is just part of a larger operation. Is that close to being right?
Well, if I talk from experience, so when our regiment attacked an enemy position not long ago, when we're moving into position, the artillery is already going off. The mortars are already going off. The drones are already overhead, flying towards enemy positions. The helicopters are going over. The jets are going over. And of course, depending on where you are, what battle. It could be more or less, but by the time that you get there, most of the damage has been done by the artillery strikes, by the drones, by the jets, by the helicopters. So of course it's more like a mopping up operation. But of course, when it comes to urban areas, it's a lot more difficult to mop up. I would say the casualties would probably end up being higher rather than storming trenches, because most of the trenches are open air, so you can target them sort of quite easily. Whereas if you're attacking urban areas, there's a lot to hide behind, But yeah, I mean they're brutal. It's no joke. That's for sure. I'm not going to downplay them. I mean it's an assault. I mean and if anyone's been involved in infantry and frontline assault, it's pretty brutal. Yeah.
There's no doctoring that up. Last question I want to, well, actually 2 questions more. One is there's been a lot of reports recently, today, as a matter of fact, that there are potentially thousands of North Korean soldiers actually training in Russia, and they may be going on. Is that a rumor, or is there any truth to that?
Well, I mean, I think the official line is that that's not true, but then I have seen videos of there's a certain video, I think you've probably seen it. It's a video of what looks like North Koreans, or looks like Koreans, training on a polygon in Russian territory. But I don't know how true that is. But then, of course, even if that is true, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to end up in the SVO. It could just be an agreement where they're training with each other. But again, I don't want to insult people's intelligence. I just don't know. I'll just be guessing.
Okay, so last thing I wanted to ask you. So right now, it's on a path where, as I just go for my own military analysis, is looking at all of the actions combined, look at the capabilities of the two sides, the industrial capacity, the manpower capacity, all of that together, in my view, makes it inevitable that the Ukraine side has already lost. They just keep on fighting until they're going down, and at some point, the Russians will eventually just grind the Ukraine army down until there won't be anything left, unless they do some sort of a big arrow movement. But here's the big question, and I wonder to what extent this is part of anybody's conversations. There is also the risk that before that final collapse happened, that there could be some Western nations that say, we need to go in to help and fight, and this could potentially escalate into a Russia on NATO fight. Do the Russian people think that they could handle that fight?
I suppose that in terms of the real answer to that question, only the politicians will know. But of course, me just being around my comrades in my regiment, I mean, they're not scared of Americans. They're not scared of British. They're not scared of Poles, because they see themselves as defending their territory and defending their people. So of course, and Russians are very proud people, and they're very strong people. I mean, they're probably some of the strongest people mentally that I know and that I've ever met. I mean, sometimes in the West, there's like a running joke where people are crazy Russians, but I mean that in a good way. Like, they are fearless, and if they're given a task, they will go out of their way to try and complete that, to complete disregard to themselves if necessary. But no, I don't think they're scared of it happening per se, or thinking that they can't win. I think they probably think they will win, regardless of whether NATO get involved. But if I'm thinking about it realistically, if NATO were to get involved, I think directly, I think it would end up the end of the world, or a very serious risk of that happening. I mean, most people with a brain know that is absolutely what the Western elites want. They want direct conflict, but I don't think it's going to happen. I hope it doesn't happen. But in terms of the industrial output, I don't think it's a case of necessarily NATO trying to drag this war out per se. I think that's more of a Russian tactic, is a battle of attrition, because they've got the infrastructure, they've got the industrial capacity to keep this war going for a very long time, whereas Ukraine definitely haven't, because it's been destroyed. Europe haven't, because they've sold off most of their infrastructure and shut down their factories and built houses and in apartments on them. And I think half of America is probably the same, where half of their industrial output is been wrecked and closed down within the past 20 years. I think that's a major problem that the West have. So, of course, if it were to spread into a direct conflict, I think you would probably be talking about weapons of mass destruction quite quickly.
Well, yeah, that's the big fear, and one of the reasons why we advocate so much that this war be brought to an end by diplomatic means at the absolute soonest possible, to stop the killing on both sides and to prevent this from escalating anywhere else. Aidan Minnis, thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your views with us. We certainly wish you Godspeed and a safe return.
Okay, it was a pleasure, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate you guys. This has been a very, very informative view here. Again, we don't take anybody's side one way or another, but you need to know how it's being viewed on both sides of the line to understand really what's going on here. And I think this has been a very illuminating interview, and we thank you very much. Be sure and like and subscribe, and by all means, share this with your friends, because this is something you're not seeing anywhere else. Thanks very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.